Hello, welcome back to my channel. I thought I'd do a little discursive piece today on what genres of short story tend to be the most successful. Now, when I say successful, I mean both creatively and probably more importantly, actually, more likely to get published. And this is from my experience of submitting to over 600 publications, making over 600 submissions and having 25 stories published, which might not sound that impressive, but I think you should aim at around about 4 to 5% success rate unless you're a genius. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to talk through my top three short story genres, what makes them work, what people expect from them, and also then go on to why other genres aren't quite so successful. So the number one genre for short stories is, probably not a surprise, it's literary fiction, which is a genre because it has certain standard expectations. It has a form, it has a shape, and you can definitely identify it. Literary fiction is generally set in here and now. It has sort of a focus on often the issues of the day, whatever those might be. Social issues, largely interpersonal issues, political issues. Not necessarily. Sometimes they are purely about one individual character and their day-to-day struggle, but it inevitably is going to come in what's happening in the society, the environment around them. Quite often they're a slice of life. In other words, we're just seeing a chunk of somebody's day or somebody's week, possibly even an hour, a moment in time, and they may not have as much structure because of that as some other stories. They don't necessarily have as big an arc. I have to say, from reading literary magazines, there's less humour. There are certainly less stories that are aimed to make you laugh in literary fiction. Generally, I would say literary fiction is made to make you have a moment of realization, or to make you think, or to make you feel that you've spent some very powerful time close to another human being whose life is different from your own. They're always very character-based, usually led by one very strong protagonist or a couple of very strong protagonists. And they're very strong on descriptive writing. There aren't too many that are written in a kind of very terse, spare Hemingway-esque, or I don't know, what's his name? The guy who wrote The Big Easy. Not Raymond Carver, the one I get him mixed up with. Raymond Chandler. They're not usually written in that very terse sort of style. They can be very purple in prose, to be honest. I've looked at some from literary magazines. I've read a couple of the stories, or the beginnings of a couple of stories, and thought, I can't write this. I just can't do it. So I've not submitted generally to those publications, because I think their editors are just not going to like the kind of writing I do, which can be quite descriptive, but I also like to keep it fairly spare in places. And I'm not disparaging this genre. Anything I say which sounds negative, I should point out this is the genre I've written most of my stories in. Probably around 60% of my stories are literary fiction, sometimes blended with another genre. But that's where it's easier to draw stories from the life that everyone around us shares. Second most popular genre, I think, although I haven't done a statistical analysis, of all the different publications, but there are many outlets for science fiction. Science fiction has a very strong history in short stories, leading back to the days of, the great science fiction magazines of the 30s, 40s, and beyond, such as Amazing, Astounding, Arthur C. Clarke's. I think most of those are either still going or they've recently been reawoken. There was always a huge market for short stories. I think partly because science fiction is a sort of experimental genre. People try out ideas in science fiction short stories that they then may go on to explore in longer works. And the readers love to have these little sort of laboratory experiments, these philosophical experiments, explore new worlds, but just in a sort of snapshot sort of way. You do need to do your research. You need to be writing it with current discoveries in mind. I mean, there is softer science fiction that's more philosophical than scientific, but if you're writing about a quantum computer, you need to know roughly what that is. You need to know what the cutting edge, where the cutting edge is. If you're writing about, obviously, anything to do with space journeys, anything to do with theories of the multiverse, just basically do a little bit of background reading if you don't know particularly much about a subject. They're usually, I almost think of them as sandboxes, like the sandbox concept in a computer game is a world where you can go and explore things. You can just go and range around, see what there is. These stories tend to do that with sexual, social, political mores. So as much as they're experimenting with technology and science, they're experimenting with everything, really, the good ones. Character is still important. Even, the much maligned character work of the classic stories of, say, Arthur C. Clarke or Robert Heinlein or Isaac Asimov. There's some decent character work going on. It's just very subtle. They can be more terse in dialogue. Dialogue particularly tends to be quite functional. There's actually surprisingly limited action. I mean, there is some action, but these don't tend to range as far as a novel would, obviously, for obvious reasons. You're not going to get galactic battles going on in a science fiction short story, really. You're probably going to have one crystal clear idea explored in some depth. They can be a little bit longer because they do tend to fit. The ideas are quite big, so they tend to push out the length of the story, so you won't get too many 1,000-word science fiction stories. Although there is the concept of the Drabble, named after Margaret Drabble, which is a 100-word story, and those are quite popular in science fiction fandom, and also there are publications that only publish such things. Surprise, obviously, is a key element. Twist endings are very common, very popular in the science fiction story, but just the idea of having some moment of surprise, which could come out quite early on in the story and then play out throughout the rest of it. So if your story has those elements, and obviously has a science fiction premise, then you will find there are plenty of venues out there. You might have to hunt a bit deeper, and some of them have really annoying submission systems where you've got to fill in like an epic form, which is, it's got tiny little fields that are almost impossible to read. And then some of them require you to email your story or have it in a weird format. I don't know why. I think because some of them have literally got now 90-year history, some of these magazines. They're a little bit finicky about submissions, and they have plenty of people competing to be in those big ones. So I would say if you're starting out, don't go for Isaac Asimov's or Astounding, or if that still exists, or what's the other one? Fantasy and science fiction. Go for something a little bit smaller. The other genre, which is pretty popular, I think, and works extremely well in short stories, is supernatural or horror. Particularly supernatural, I would say. Ghost stories, of course, have an even longer pedigree than science fiction stories, and you can get a really lovely shape into a ghost story, and you can do some of the fun atmosphere building that you'd have in literary fiction, but you can also have the surprise elements of science fiction, and you can work on a deep emotional level, because horror kind of inspires disgust and fear. Supernatural stories sort of inspire fear, or its polite cousin, trepidation. There are tropes that you can employ, explore, explode, or just ignore, such as ghosts, obviously, zombies, overdone I would say now, vampires, again, unless you do something very brave and different with it, might want to avoid. But then again, there are publications that actually want those specific things. So you can write very tightly to a premise. You're often given these writing prompts or themes in these publications. If you happen to have a story that fits, that's great. Or you can write one to order, and then if they don't want it, you can send it somewhere else. I love the concept of the uncanny. So I like short stories that have a little bit of like M.R. James classic short stories, where there's a sort of creeping sense of menace or dread. Those are still quite popular, actually. Characters can be, I dare say this, I mean, it's going to sound, people are going to hate this, but characters can be a little bit less complex in a supernatural or horror story, because you almost need them to be the steadfast, predictable element in a world that doesn't play by the rules. So although they may change or discover something in the story, this is why M.R. James characters all seem sort of fusty academics who don't believe in the uncanny. That's the basic M.R. James character, a rationalist, because that's the person who would be most affected by something inexplicable happening in their world. That's not to say you can't have rounded characters. You may need a bit more space for them. You might just need to have a longer story to do that. Twist endings almost a given in the supernatural or horror genres. If the story ends as people expect it to, they're often left with a kind of shrug feeling of, well, I thought he'd be chopped in half. He'd be killed by the pendulum swinging across the pit, and he was. Oh well. So yeah. So those three genres, I think, are the most successful, both creatively and in terms of getting your work out there. Here are some that work less well. Romance. Now, it may be that I've never written a romance story. I've not written a straight romance story. I've had stories that are strongly romantic, but they always allied with literary fiction, because I can't do the cliched lovey-dovey stuff, and I'm not sure there are that many short story markets for that. There might be some in women's, what used to be called women's magazines, Women's Own or things like that. Maybe Reader's Digest or Candace, which is a magazine for cancer sufferers. Might work for an older audience, but the outlets are somewhat limited. Westerns. Is anyone writing short stories set in the Old West? Maybe in America. I haven't found any publications that are particularly fond of those ideas. Comedy, believe it or not, there probably are some specific magazines for comedy. I haven't really come across many, and there aren't many. If you're going to apply for a competition, it's almost like the prejudice against comedy films. No one's giving Will Ferrell, or Jim Carrey when he was doing pure comedy films, or Eddie Murphy again when he was funny. No one's giving those people Oscars. No one's giving the screenplays awards. I think only like 2 or 3 out-and-out comedies have ever won an Academy Award, and the same really applies for funny short stories, which is a great shame. P.G. Wodehouse is one of the greatest writers you'll ever encounter. Very short, very funny stories, short novels and stories, I believe. Children's short fiction may be a thing, but again, I haven't really come across it. It's a shame, but I think people believe nowadays, kids, you might as well write a short children's book. You can sell more copies, or graphic novels or comics. But children's short fiction, which ought to be a thing, because it'd be great for bedtime reading. There's the classics, the grim fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, that sort of stuff, but there just seems to be less of it now. I mean, maybe you can change that. War and action. Probably because the scope is too big to squeeze into a short. I've written a sort of story set in the trenches, but it was more like literary fiction, where very little actually happened, and it was about describing the atmosphere that must have been there. It was sort of me trying to think myself into that situation. Action, again, I don't know how you do that in like a massive scale story with lots of action in a short. Again, all of these things are possible, but they're harder and there's less outlets for them. And finally, historical. I have written a few historical short stories. I cannot sell them, no matter how convincingly, how beautifully I write them. I've only sold one, which was on Vincent van Gogh. So, kind of, yes, it's historical, set in the 1880s, but it's about a painter, a real person, so it has some interest to people who are enthusiasts of the arts. Yeah, historical, I mean, try, give it a go. I just find I'm not making headway. Maybe I'm just not very good in that genre. It's possible. So anyway, those are my thoughts on which genres tend to be most successful, both creatively and in terms of getting published. So to recap, the number one genre, unsurprisingly, is literary fiction. The second most popular is science fiction or fantasy. I haven't really mentioned fantasy. I think fantasy is less common because, again, it's massive world building. Doesn't tend to work well on a small scale. But most of the science fiction magazines will also publish fantasy. And finally, supernatural or horror shorts tend to work pretty well. So there you go. If you've written any of those things, you already have a head start. So send them out. Keep sending your work out. Do what I do. Get 2 rejections, send out 3 stories. That way, the stuff you're waiting to hear about will only ever get bigger and bigger. And you'll get published if you're any good. So, I've started a new story, but I've got a suspicion it's going to be a bit of a long one because it's in science fiction and the world is quite big. The world that I'm sort of creating, or the ideas I'm playing with. So I may have that for you tomorrow, maybe the day after. But until then, see you later.